Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is David Chalmers, author of a new book called Reality Plus, which is about virtual worlds and the problems of philosophy seen afresh in light of advances in artificial intelligence. Dave is a professor of philosophy at NYU. He's a leading scholar in the philosophy of mind and the science of consciousness and reality. His book explores the larger questions around virtual reality and the emerging metaverse. It looks at the relationship between AI, the mind, virtual reality, and consciousness. Mind-bending stuff, which he's going to explain, so listen up. Dave, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Vasant. It's great to be here.
In the city or up in Hudson Valley?
I am in New York City, living in NYU faculty housing, just about a block away from you, I think, and just south of Washington Square.
Well, talking about Washington Square, New York City, tell us your journey and what brought you here.
There's a long and winding path to get here. I actually I'm now a professor of philosophy, but I started out in math, in physics, and computer science. Growing up, I was a bit of a math geek, going to math Olympiads and so on. And I studied math for my undergraduate degree. Even I went to that was in Australia, in Adelaide. I went to the University of Adelaide and then to Oxford University to continue with a doctorate. But somewhere along the way, I caught the philosophy bug, and in particular, the consciousness bug. It seemed to me that there was all these interesting questions in math and physics, to be sure, but it would have been so exciting to be doing them, say, 300 or 400 years ago, when we didn't even understand the fundamentals and we're just coming to grips with the really big questions. And then I looked around and said, what is like that today? And I thought, really, the study of the human mind, and in particular, the study of consciousness, subjective experience, the way it feels to be a sentient being, it's the most obvious fact about our existence, but also the thing we really don't understand. So for a long time, I would kind of think about this on the side, kind of think, okay, surely no one would actually pay you to think about this. It's just too much fun to think about. But I gradually became obsessed by it and got to the point where I started spending every waking hour thinking about consciousness. At the same time, I'd been in touch with Doug Hofstadter at Indiana. I knew his books, Gödel, Escherbach, and The Mind's Eye, which had been very influential for me as a teenager in the late 70s. And at a certain point, he said, why don't you come to Indiana and work with me? So I ended up picking up sticks from Oxford, moving to Indiana and starting again in philosophy and cognitive science in the context of an AI lab that Doug was running, surrounded by people in philosophy, psychology, computer science, and everything else. And I did a fair amount of work on AI, but ended up writing a thesis on consciousness, on the problem of explaining consciousness. And that ended up turning into a book, The Conscious Mind. So for a long time, and this was a very exciting time in the 1990s, the science of consciousness was just getting off the ground. It was gradually becoming a somewhat respectable topic for scientists to talk about again, neuroscientists, psychologists, as well as philosophers. So I spent a lot of time thinking about consciousness and the mind, and that continues where we'll now, I guess about just over 10 years ago, I moved to NYU, where we have a Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness devoted to foundational issues in the mind-brain sciences, which include issues about consciousness and issues about AI and issues about rationality and so on. But somewhere along the line, I got really interested in questions about, not just questions about consciousness, but also questions about reality. And that's what led to this book I've just published 2 or 3 months ago now, called Reality Plus, which is basically a philosophical investigation of virtual reality. I mean, the technology has been advancing so fast. There's now VR headsets everywhere. People are talking about building the metaverse. And I'm just really interested in, what does this come to philosophically to think about this technology, and also how does thinking about this technology actually shed some light on some very traditional questions in philosophy.
Yeah, I gotta say, your timing, it was impeccable in the sense that, AI was still relatively primitive in the 90s, but sort of, making its moves. Machine learning was
Mm-hmm.
becoming kind of respectable and coming into its own. And you sort of occupy a really unique space, I see, in this nexus between computing and philosophy. Your book, Reality Plus, is like nothing I've read in either philosophy or computing. In the book, you refer to techno-philosophy, which is somewhat new and unique. So tell us a little bit more about it. What is techno-philosophy, and how is it different from traditional philosophy and the philosophy of technology?
So I think of techno philosophy as a two-way interaction between philosophy and technology. So one part of it is thinking philosophically about technology. And this part of it is maybe continuous with what's sometimes called the philosophy of technology, thinking about AI technology. What can it do? Can it give you genuine intelligence? Can it give you a genuine mind? Thinking about smartphones and the internet, for example, how might they extend your mind, thinking about, in the book, thinking about virtual reality, especially. Are virtual realities genuine realities? Can you live a meaningful life there? So that part is thinking philosophically about the technologies we're using, what they mean, what they'll lead to, what their implications are. But the other half of techno philosophy is actually using all this thinking about technology to shed light on some very traditional philosophical questions. For example, thinking about the idea of virtual realities or the universe as a simulation to shed light on the famous question that goes back to Rene Descartes and even further, how do we know anything about the external world around us? Descartes said, how do you know you're not being fooled by an evil demon right now? And these days people say, how do you know you're not in a computer simulation? Likewise, you can use modern technology to put forward hypotheses about the nature of reality, to think about the connection between mind and body. I mean, thinking about AI has been already been very influential in making people think in very general terms about the human mind. I think we can do something similar for reality. So yeah, techno philosophy is all about this two-way integration. The term is actually inspired by a book that the Canadian American philosopher Patricia Churchland wrote in the late 1980s called neurophilosophy, which was similarly involved a two-way interaction between philosophy and neuroscience. Yes, the philosophy of neuroscience, thinking philosophically about what's coming out of the neuroscience, but also using neuroscience to help address traditional questions about the mind and the mind and the body and their relationship. And her view was that neuroscience can really add a lot to philosophy. My view is that technology can do the same thing.
Yeah, great parallel. I had a neuroscientist, Tony Zador, on the
Mm.
show a couple of months ago. We were talking about the fact that neuroscience is going through a real renaissance, as has AI. And both these fields have made substantial progress in the last few decades, right? I mean, the kinds of questions you're asking wouldn't have carried the same kind of heft 30 or 40 years ago, right? When AI was relatively primitive. And I think we can probably say the same for neuroscience, that both of these techno-philosophy and the neurophilosophy have really benefited from the fact that these fields have sort of really burgeoned and we've made some real progress. So the timing has been really good. So let's get into a little depth here. You open your book with this line by Freddie Mercury. Is this the real life or is it a fantasy? And prior to where we started, we were just bantering about the fact that Freddie Mercury grew up in Bombay,
Hmm.
and he was part of the Parsi community. And then in the same chapter, you talk about Chinese philosophers and ancient Hindu philosophy, which has sort of had a long tradition of sort of questioning, what is real and what is illusory, or something that they call Maya. And you refer to the sage Narada, which interestingly is very personal to me because my mother used to read me these epics, and Narada was part of a character. And I remember he had a curse where he couldn't sit still in one place. He had to be sort of constantly moving. And I nicknamed one of my uncles Narad Ji because he could never sit still. And Ji, of course, is the sort of suffix for being respectful in Hindi. So you refer to Narad and him having this dream in which he is Sushila and has 8 sons and all of that stuff. So and then he realizes that it's a dream, or rather, Vishnu tells him it's a dream, and he then asks Vishnu that how do I know that what I'm in at the moment is not a dream? And so you sort of set up this sort of simulation hypothesis that way. So tell us a little bit more about this. Or walk us through the building blocks of the simulation hypothesis that you set up.
Yeah, I mean, you might think the simulation hypothesis is a very modern idea. And in some respects, it is the idea that we are actually right now living in a computer simulation. I mean, you can't really entertain that very idea without knowing about computers, which of course only came along in the middle of the 20th century. But you do find recognizable antecedents of the idea in almost every philosophical tradition, and saying, encapsulated in that Freddie Mercury question: is this the real life, or is it just fantasy? So yeah, the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi said, how do I know? He wakes up from a dream of being a butterfly and says, now here I am, Zhuangzi. But then he says, well, how do I know that I'm actually Zhuangzi, who just dreamed he was a butterfly? Maybe I'm now a butterfly dreaming that he's Zhuangzi. And this raises the question: how do I know that all this isn't a dream? I mean, we find this trope repeatedly. I take it in the ancient Hindu tradition, yeah, including all these stories of Vishnu and Narada. Narada tells Vishnu, "I have conquered illusion. I have conquered Maya," and so Vishnu then gives him this whole experience of turns him into a woman. She lives 50 years with children and grandchildren. And then there's a war and there's a massacre and they all die. And it's tragic. And then Vishnu brings Narada back and says, yeah, that all just happened. That all just happened in 2 minutes. I've now shown you the power of Maya, of illusion. Interestingly, that very ancient Hindu story is repeated in an episode of Rick and Morty, the animated TV series where Rick, the mad scientist, takes Morty, his grandson, to a weird video game arcade where they play the game Roy: A Life Well Lived, and Morty gets to live 50 years as a football star turned carpet salesman, and goes through all this 50 years of experience, comes back, and it's 2 minutes later. So yeah, this trope is everywhere. Yeah, and each version of this raises the question of, what is real? How do I know what is real? Plato, in the ancient Greek tradition, had his story of the cave. We could be prisoners chained up, just looking at shadows on the cave wall. How do we know that we're seeing the genuine reality here? And of course, these days, we ask the question with computers. How do I know that I'm here in genuine physical reality? Could it be that all this is a computer simulation running on a computer? Virtual reality technology is actually now developing fast enough that this kind of technology is going to be possible, probably quite soon, within decades perhaps. And then that will make this a really live question. How do we know that we're not right now in a virtual reality?
Yeah, you see this trope repeated everywhere, including the Black Mirror. In fact, you referred to this
Mhm.
episode White Christmas, which I recall watching.
That's a classic.
Where just so it's all over the place now. And there he sort of simulates again a few years in a couple of minutes. Just fascinating how it's showing up everywhere. So let's ground ourselves here, Dave. Like, what is reality?
What is reality? Reality itself is one of those things that has multiple definitions. But I think reality, in its broadest sense, reality is everything that exists. Or as Ludwig Wittgenstein put it, the world is everything that is the case. You know, and the question, I mean, we don't, that's the definition of reality. That doesn't tell us what reality is. There are many different philosophical views of what reality is. One of the ancient views is, again, you find in many Indian traditions, is idealism, that reality is fundamentally consciousness. The fundamental elements of reality are consciousness and the mind, and reality is all in the mind, and there's nothing outside the mind. These days, a more popular view of reality is materialism or physicalism, that reality is fundamentally physical, that, the world is made up of a bunch of particles interacting according to certain laws, or maybe a giant quantum wave function, or whatever's underneath quantum gravity, but all fundamentally physical processes. But then there are other ideas. If you're inspired by the technology idea of computation as being possibly fundamental to reality, we get this it's from bit hypothesis that maybe reality is itself somehow computational. Maybe there's a level of digital physics and there are algorithmic laws of nature underlying the reality we experience. And closely connected to that is the idea that our reality might itself turn out to be a computer process running in some kind of computer simulation in the next universe up. Of course, that version of the hypothesis just kicks the question to what's going on in the next universe up and what is the nature of reality there. But the general idea behind reality plus is that there's more to reality than we might have thought. We might have thought that all this was what we're seeing and experience, our naive reality. That's it. Reality plus says no, there may be many virtual realities, simulations. Our universe could be a virtual world inside a multiverse of other realities. We can ourselves build this metaverse of new realities. And then you have this whole system of realities that I call reality plus.
Well, let's unpack that because there's a lot in there. And you said, you talked about the it from bit hypothesis. So explain that. What exactly does it mean?
Yeah, so this is an idea that goes back to the pioneering physicist John Wheeler, who wrote an article, I think in the late 1980s, putting forward this it from bit slogan where he says the idea is that, okay, an it is an object, chairs and tables and bodies or cells, if you like, but more fundamentally, say particles, the particles we take to be fundamental in physics, atoms, quarks, photons. And then Wheeler said, my hypothesis is all these its, those things, ultimately derive from a pattern of bits, like yes, no, 0, 1, matters of fact at the fundamental level. And what's fundamental in reality is bits, this whole system of zeros and ones. Wheeler's own views here are very complex, and it seems that there may even have been an element of idealism in them, in that he seemed to think that observation was very important, which if observation is fundamental, then it looks like there's some element of mind creeping into physics. But what I take from it, and what many people have taken from it, is the idea that there could be a fundamentally digital level of reality. And here we have, cellular automata like John Conway's Game of Life are a beautiful illustration here. The Game of Life, every cell is a two-dimensional grid of cells, infinite in both directions, with every cell can be on or off, and there are very simple rules for how cells update their states. But this gives you this digital physics of life. In some ways, can be as complex as a physical universe. And then, so the it from bit idea is maybe there's a digital level underneath the familiar level of its, and that would hence it from bit. The its, the atoms, and the cells, and go on.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. Just want to make sure I don't lose the thread. So I think you refer somewhere to sort of God said, "Let there be bits," as opposed to sort of "Let there be light" or whatever. And when I read through those chapters, I had to read them several times just to make sure that I understood them. If I understand this correctly, you're saying that the hypothesis is that what we observe in terms of atoms and light waves and all of that could be sort of manifestation of something that arises out of this digital reality of zeros and ones. That is, you can actually, from zeros and ones, create the universe as we see it in terms of atoms and real objects. So everything is information at the end of the day. Is that a reasonable paraphrasing?
Yeah, something like that is the it from bit hypothesis. We've gotten used to the idea that underneath biology, there's a level of chemistry. From you get cells out of molecules. You get molecules out of atoms underneath chemistry. There's a level of physics. Atoms are made up of more fundamental particles like quarks and electrons. Maybe all this derives from a quantum wave function. And now we just add to this, underneath all that is a level of bits of information, if you like. I mean, you could imagine physicists discovering this empirically, that, yeah, underneath quarks and electrons, we'll find a digital physics of ones and zeros. Now, this is not something which, as far as I can tell, physicists have discovered and are taking all that seriously, although you will find some people. Stephen Wolfram is an example of someone who speculated that this kind of digital physics may underlie the physics of today. But if you imagine that we live in part of my thought is that if we discovered that we live in a computer simulation, then some version of this it from bit hypothesis would actually be correct. Because if we're in a computer simulation, everything around us, this cup of water, these books, and so on, are made up out of processes running in a computer. They're made up of a digital level of existence. There is a question as to whether the digital level is the ultimate level. The pure it from bit hypothesis says the fundamental level of reality is digital, and it just stops at ones and zeros, which is interesting and beautiful, but not mandatory here, I think. The other version, which I take seriously, is what I call the it from it hypothesis. All these objects are made of bits, but the bits themselves are maybe made of some more fundamental level of its. And actually, if we're in a computer simulation, I think the it from it hypothesis is very natural. The things we interact with in this world are made up of bits, computer processes running on a computer in the next world up. But underneath those algorithmic processes is a physical implementation of the algorithm running on some kind of computer-like entity with analogs of voltages and transistors, whatever they have playing that role in the next universe up. And that would, in effect, be a version of it from it. Yeah, the its in our world come from these algorithmic bits, and the bits come from further its in the next world up.
Wow. I mean, this is like, totally far out. So, how seriously do physicists and philosophers take this possibility that we might be living in a simulation? I recall when Nick Bostrom proposed this almost a decade ago. It seemed like one of those kind of real Twilight Zone ideas, but it's gotten more traction now. Why is that?
Yeah, the simulation hypothesis itself has been around for quite a while, not least in science fiction. There were science fiction novels spelling out versions of it in the 1960s. The first filmed version of it was Rainer Werner Fassbinder had put together a German miniseries called Welt am Wehr, World on a Wire, in 1973. And of course, we had The Matrix in the late 90s that turned a whole lot of people onto this idea. This is just at the level of putting forward the hypothesis. And I think initially, say for a philosopher, it's a weird hypothesis. And the question is, might this be true? Could it be true? Is there any way we can rule it out? And at least initially, it's put forward as a weird hypothesis, like the hypotheses that Descartes put forward. Could we be dreaming? Could this be an illusion? Could this be an evil demon fooling us? But in the case of the simulation hypothesis, I think it's turned out there are actually maybe more reasons to take this seriously than those previous way out hypotheses. And part of it is we're actually developing the technology for simulated worlds pretty fast. Simulation technology is getting better and better. There are cosmic simulations. Yeah, not all that detailed, but getting more and more detailed all the time. There are simulations at every level of physics. So simulation technology is getting good. Virtual reality technology is getting good. probably within some number of decades, we're going to have virtual realities indistinguishable from physical reality. So that suddenly makes this a more realistic possibility. And then we add in the kind of, you mentioned Nick Bostrom, who developed kind of statistical argument that we may well be in a simulation. The basic idea there is that we should expect that most non-simulated populations will eventually develop simulation technology and will eventually produce many simulated worlds, many simulated beings. And then if you follow this on, it becomes natural to think there are going to be many more simulated worlds than unsimulated worlds, many more simulated beings than unsimulated beings. And you think, what are the odds that I'm one of the minority of beings who are unsimulated? And from a certain perspective, it can suddenly start to seem quite probable that we are simulated beings, because most beings in the cosmos will be simulated. Now, there's a lot of assumptions packed into that argument, and a lot of ways it can go wrong. Maybe these civilizations won't produce popular simulations because they think it's a bad idea. Maybe simulated beings can't be conscious. There's a lot packed in there, but I think that kind of reasoning is that kind of reasoning, I think, does give us very good reason to take this hypothesis seriously. It doesn't mean that that has to be true. Of course, it doesn't have to be true. We might not be in a simulation, but I do think it takes it from beyond the status of mere science fiction to the status of a serious hypothesis to entertain about our world.
That's interesting. So it's the tech that's made this more credible in a sense. This reminds me of Isaac Asimov's The Naked Sun, which is about this Earth colony, and a policeman from Earth is summoned there to investigate a murder because they've never had a murder. There's no police force. It's all virtual. They never see each other face to face, and when they do, they maintain a distance of 6 feet. Interestingly, and this Earth policeman goes there, and he has a meeting with the head of the council. And when the meeting's over, he realizes that it was virtual. He thought this person was in front of him, but he could not tell. So he could not actually distinguish reality from the virtual reality. And so when I read your book, I couldn't help but think of that and say, okay, so the reasoning here is, let's assume that we have perfect virtual reality where we cannot tell real from virtual. Let's sort of fast forward into the future where real people have created many virtual people that vastly outnumber them. And so if you pick someone at random and ask them, are you in a simulation? The answer is likely to be yes. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's very much the idea. You've got to imagine this cosmos, reality plus of all these physical realities and simulated realities, and maybe many more simulated realities than unsimulated realities, many more simulated beings and unsimulated beings. So yeah, if you just pick one at random, the chances are they're going to be a simulated being.
So I guess so Descartes' evil demon sounded a little kind of far out, but given virtual reality, suddenly you replace that. When you get computers, you don't need God. I don't know who said that. Maybe you said that, or I read that somewhere. Is that sort of this whole technology and virtual reality makes God less sort of central?
Well, maybe actually, if we're in a simulation, our God is just a hacker in the next universe up who happens to have run this very simulation. And maybe it's a scientist studying a whole bunch of different universes for their own purposes. Maybe it's someone trying to run some predictions. Maybe it's a historian investigating the past of their own world. But yeah, our God may not be especially godly.
Or maybe it's a teen girl running a simulation somewhere and there's a little bug and it's all happening because of that.
Exactly. I've got a wonderful illustration in this book. This book is full of amazing illustrations by an illustrator, Tim Peacock, who did an amazing job illustrating these ideas. And maybe my favorite in the whole book is the one where, reality is created by a teenage girl sitting at her computer, and then there are these lines, and so the whole universe is coming out of this virtual world, and she is in effect our God.
I love those illustrations, by the way. I think one could almost do the whole thing using illustrations.
Yeah, I think they're the best part of the book, to be honest.
So let's come back to reality and virtual reality. So you make the case at several points in the book that virtual reality is real, and that sounds almost like a contradiction. So explain that. Like, how can virtual reality be real?
Yeah, so this is really the central thesis of the book, that virtual reality is genuine reality. And this does run against a very common way of thinking about virtual reality, which is virtual realities are fake realities or fictional realities or illusions or hallucinations. More generally, that they're second class realities. I want to say virtual realities are actually genuine realities. And one way to come at this is to think about the extreme case. Just say it turns out we're in a simulation. Should we then say that none of this is real? That chairs and tables aren't real, for example? They're just illusions? I think no. I think if we're in a giant simulation like that, there are still chairs and tables out there. They're just digital objects. They're made from bits, as the it from bit hypothesis we discussed suggests. They may be digital objects, but digital objects are still real. I mean, these days, digital objects are a huge part of the real world for most of us. They affect us in all kinds of ways. So I think we need to get over this idea of thinking if it's digital, it's not real. And yeah, if we're in a simulation, then the objects around us are digital objects. They may be created by a simulator, but that's just to say there's a creator as well. So I end up arguing that if we're in a simulation, we should think of this as a version of what I call the it from bit creation hypothesis, that the creator created the world by arranging the bits. You mentioned let there be bits. But the key idea is that, yeah, virtual objects or digital objects, which are real, and this brings back the question, what do you mean by real? And there's many things you can mean by real, but one key notion is that something is real if it makes a difference in the world, if it has the causal powers to affect other things. And I think digital objects certainly have that. If we're in a simulation, the digital objects which make up these chairs and tables still have all the causal powers that we thought they did. Another criterion for reality is something is real if it's something is not real if it's all in the mind, like a dream, and something is real if it's outside our minds. And again, in this case, I would say that digital objects inside virtual reality, they exist even when we're not paying attention. Just go to a big video game like World of Warcraft or Minecraft or whatever. And then I can detach myself from those virtual worlds, but they will continue to exist on a server somewhere. So these exist independently of our minds. And I would argue most fundamentally that they needn't be illusions or hallucinations. Even when and this doesn't just apply to the grand scale simulation idea. This also applies to the kind of virtual worlds that we can inhabit today, maybe through a virtual reality headset or even on just on a regular two-dimensional screen. I would say that here one's interacting with virtual objects, which are real digital objects that have causal powers in our life that should not be regarded as fictions or illusions or hallucinations. They're just as real as the physical world.
I'm going to try and, I guess, reduce it to something you say in your book, which is it consists of, you sort of have this as a test for reality, right? Can be test whether something is real, and you say, well, does it exist? Does it have causal powers, and is its existence independent of our mind? And then there's two others. One is it as it seems? And is it genuine? So what about the is it as it seems? Is that potentially problematic given that things don't always appear to be what they are?
It's true, and many things in the world are not as they seem. So I don't want to say things are exactly as they seem. I mean, it's certainly true that, for example, if we turned out to be in a simulation, things would be digital objects. And it's true that pre-theoretically, things don't seem to be digital objects. But I'd also say that things don't seem to be quantum mechanical objects. But nonetheless, if physics is right, then the objects around us are quantum mechanical objects. So I take the moral of that to be that we don't know everything about the objects we're interacting with. But still, the question arises, the way things seem to be is, it seems to me that there's a glass of water here located at a certain position in space in front of me. And I would argue, even if I am even if this is a quantum mechanical world, there's still a glass of water here. Likewise, even if this is a digital world or virtual world, there's still a glass of water here located in a certain position in space in front of me. At least to that extent, things really are as they seem. I mean, it's a little bit tricky because things aren't always exactly as they seem. In the book, I talk about the Garden of Eden, the idea of how things seem to us pre-theoretically, a very simple world of objects with colors out there in a world of three-dimensional space and one-dimensional time. And it's an oversimplified model of the world, and things are not exactly that way. But still, we've got the idea that things are at least roughly as they seem, even though physics is very different from the way it seems. There still really is a cup out there with these properties. And I would say the same can be true if reality turns out to be virtual.
One of your later chapters is called Is Reality a Mathematical Structure? And I was fascinated by that question. So, is it a mathematical structure?
I very much like the idea that you can kind of articulate the structure of reality in mathematical terms. If you say reality is wholly a mathematical structure, I think maybe there are some limits on that. For a start, mathematics, as I understand it, is pure mathematics. A pure mathematical structure is like an abstract object, like, I don't know, a group or a differential manifold and so on, or just a set of numbers. Those are abstract objects. I don't think they actually have any causal powers in reality. They don't actually do anything. So I think, for a start, reality involves things that exist and that have causal powers that are concrete, if you like. So it's not just mathematics in the pure mathematical sense. It's at the very least applied mathematics. It's a mathematical structure which is somehow embodied in some substrate in physical reality. But it could be that reality is almost completely describable in mathematical terms. And that's what I think of as the aim of a whole lot of science, and especially, say, mathematical physics, to give a complete mathematical description of reality, to formulate all the basic laws of nature in mathematical terms. And maybe once you spell out all that math, you can then completely describe nature in mathematical terms. We'll give some mathematical equations. And I think of all this as ultimately articulating the causal structure of reality, the components of reality, and the patterns in which they interact, specified in purely mathematical terms. So this is what I think of as kind of a structuralist picture of reality, and in particular of what physics tells us about reality. I think what physics ultimately tells us about reality is its mathematical structure and the way things evolve and interact. And this is really interesting then when it comes to the simulation idea, because I would say that if we're in a computer simulation, then all that mathematical structure which physics was attributing to physical reality is also present in a simulated reality. The simulations, by their nature, kind of replicate some of that structure. And that's all it takes for, say, for physics to be true. Now, if we're in a simulation, there's also going to be some extra structure underneath, say, the level of physics. Maybe that will be realized by some extra structure, but that's still going to, I think, be consistent with the truth of physics. So yeah, really the key thing that actually gets a lot of the theses in the book going is this structuralist picture about, what it is about the physical world. We think maybe naively of the physical world as this absolute three-dimensional space of objects sitting in space, evolving in time with colors and so on. Maybe we think we have a more than mathematical grip on the nature of reality. But the more you look at physics, the more it looks like that naive picture, what I call the Garden of Eden picture of, the world as solid billiard balls sitting out there in space and interacting, is the wrong picture. And the right picture is this mathematical picture of reality. And that's a picture that's really very well suited to vindicate virtual reality as reality.
Wow, thanks for that really interesting fleshing out of techno-philosophy, where we started this conversation, and specifically this framing of reality mathematically and structurally. And in your book, you refer to, I guess, the Vienna Circle and Rudolf Carnap as kind of laying out some of the foundations of this structuralism.
very popular view in contemporary philosophy of science, where they call it structural realism. This may even be the dominant view in philosophy of science these days.
Yes, yes. No, I was sort of particularly influenced by that myself. I mean, I was in Pittsburgh in the '80s, and I actually
Mm.
happened to sit in on some seminars by Carl Hempel and Larry Loudon, who you also mentioned
Oh,
in
fantastic.
your book. And I lived with three philosophers of science, so
Oh,
our
okay. Yeah.
discussions, yeah. So who
Who?
drove me crazy because
Anyone still in the field?
I think a couple of them are in the field,
Uh-huh.
but I'm not entirely sure. I sort of lost touch with them, but they drove me
Mm.
crazy because I was an engineer and these were philosophers, and so I was always the butt of jokes. Like he probably thinks that Newton was right, and I was like, wasn't he? I mean, of course, I'd say that for just for effect, but yeah, I was very influenced by that school myself. So it's interesting to sort of see that thread in your book. So I want to switch gears a little bit and come back to one of your major areas of inquiry, which is consciousness. How does consciousness relate to reality and intelligence?
Yeah. So I think of consciousness as subjective experience. Consciousness is really how we experience the world from the first person point of view. So it feels like something to see and to hear and to think. These are all elements of the inner movie, if you like, that each of us experiences. And the question is, how does this subjective experience relate to everything else in the world? You asked about intelligence. So I distinguish between one way to distinguish between consciousness and intelligence is to say intelligence is all about really objective things, how it is that a system behaves, how it functions, how it communicates, how it walks and talks. Ultimately comes down to a matter of intelligent behavior, how well systems can achieve their goals, and so on. That's a pretty objective, mechanistic matter from the third person point of view. And there's no obvious mystery in the idea how could a physical system be intelligent? It's just a matter of producing all those objective behaviors. But for consciousness, this by contrast is subjective. So it's a matter of what it's like from the first person point of view for the system. And yeah, maybe it's possible you could have a system that was intelligent, but that had no consciousness. Some people entertain that idea. And even if you think that all intelligent systems will have some element of consciousness, we can still distinguish the subjective aspect from the objective aspect. And for me, it's that subjective aspect that's always been the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that processes in a physical system could give rise to subjective experience at all? You also asked about the relation to reality. What's the relationship between consciousness and reality? And I guess one thing to say is it's part of reality. Consciousness is real. It's an incredibly important part of reality that we are conscious. Some people would say consciousness is all of reality. That's the idealist, and let's say in those ancient Indian traditions who think that reality is all in the mind. If you think that, then you'll say consciousness is all of reality. But I'm not inclined to go in that direction myself. I think there's reality outside consciousness. Physics, for example, is a form of reality that at least appears to be outside consciousness. So I'd say, there's a physical world outside our consciousness, and that somehow. And then the hard problem is, how does that physical reality outside our consciousness connect to consciousness? Are they distinct? Does one reduce to the other? Is physics just consciousness? Is consciousness just physics? Maybe, for many people on the materialist side here, they're going to think, we can get consciousness from physics. But in the first instance, reality is everything there is, including minds, but also including the physical world. And consciousness is just that part of it, which is subjective experience.
I like the fact that there was a test for reality, right? I mean, you could ask those five
A
questions and say,
checklist, yeah,
is the answer yes? Is
yeah.
there like a similar test for consciousness?
Interesting. A checklist for consciousness. Maybe we can find a checklist of different things people mean by consciousness, but that's a little bit different. Like there's self consciousness. being conscious of yourself. There's consciousness in the sense of being awake. I say I'm conscious when I wake up. I'm unconscious when I go to sleep. Sometimes I say some information is conscious if it's accessible to me, and not conscious if it's not accessible. So those are all senses of the word consciousness we can distinguish. But I think the most fundamental sense, at least the one I care about the most, the one that seems most puzzling, and for many people is at the core, is consciousness as subjective experience. And here the test is one test here is there something it's like to be a being? My colleague Tom Nagel in the philosophy department here at NYU, who just retired a few years ago, wrote a famous article in the 1970s called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And they're the idea, well, we don't really know what it's like to be a bat, what it feels like to be, using all that sonar and so on to get around. But presumably there's something it's like to be a bat. That's to say the bat has some subjective experience, whereas most people would say there's nothing it's like to be a glass of water. A glass of water, most people would say, does not have subjective experiences. So it's not phenomenally conscious. And similarly with our own mental states, some states of our brain, like seeing, seems to be a state of subjective experience. There's something it's like to see, but maybe there's nothing it's like for, I don't know, processes deep in my brain to analyze the syntax of language, or to regulate my neural firing and so on. That's not something I subjectively experience directly. So I guess the key item on the checklist for me then would be consciousness as subjective experience, where there's something it's like to have a state. And that's philosophers sometimes call that phenomenal consciousness.
Would the subjective experience be necessary or sufficient or both
For consciousness,
for consciousness?
I would say necessary and sufficient, because this is just an account of what I mean by consciousness in this sense. If a system doesn't have subjective experience, it's not conscious in the sense I care about. If it does have subjective experience, it is conscious in the sense I care about. It needn't be exactly consciousness as it is in a human being, but people argue about whether fish are conscious, whether insects are conscious. But again, I'd say if the insect has subjective experience, then it's conscious in the sense I care about.
I guess intuitively I'd expect sort of levels of consciousness. I was watching one of your earlier talks, and I don't remember which one it was, and you referred to Giulio Tononi and sort
Mm-hmm.
of this integrated information theory. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping to have Giulio on the show later in the year sometime.
Mm-hmm.
But what really struck me about the theory was that instead of getting, this is my very naive interpretation, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm completely wrong. But what my takeaway was, instead of getting too hung up on defining consciousness, let's assume that it exists,
Mm-hmm.
that we are actually examples of its existence, and clearly there's a physical system that produces it. So we know there's a physical system that's capable of producing consciousness. Now, are there other physical systems that are also sufficient for producing consciousness, right? So I can imagine that my dog has consciousness as well, but at a different level than mine in some ways, and of a different variety in other ways.
Yeah, I think consciousness very definitely comes in many varieties, many types, maybe many levels. Very basic kinds of consciousness may be shared even by simple organisms, like maybe the feeling of pain is one core element of consciousness, or the feeling of pleasure, or it's getting slightly more sophisticated, seeing light versus dark. Maybe even an insect can have that. But then you get to more complex elements of consciousness, like, say, the consciousness of thinking, of reasoning, and so on. And maybe an insect doesn't have that, and maybe who knows whether a dog has something like that. Probably much less than a human has. We also have self consciousness, consciousness of ourself as a thinking, conscious being. We're conscious even of the fact that we're conscious. That's something possibly that only humans have, and the dogs don't have. So yeah, I think it's very. And one thing the science of consciousness in recent years has begun to do is to map out all these different states and levels of consciousness and to theorize about them separately. For example, what's the neural basis in the brain for the experience of pain? What's the basis for the experience of seeing? What's the basis for the experience of thinking? And then people have tried to put together global theories of all these kinds of consciousness, of which, yeah, you mentioned Giulio Tononi, whose integrated information theory is perhaps the most ambitious proposal of these forms, where he tries to map out how the mathematical structure of consciousness derives from the mathematical properties of underlying networks of elements connected up in the right way. And he formulates a mathematical measure that he calls phi for the amount of integrated information in the system. The higher the phi of the system, the more consciousness it has, if you like. And this is a very controversial theory, but at least it does take a step in the direction of trying to formulate a mathematical theory of consciousness in all its varieties. And I think it's at least admirable ambition there.
Very interesting and ambitious indeed. Consciousness came up in a somewhat narrower way in my conversation with Jan LeCun, who alluded to consciousness as a manifestation of the limitation of the human mind. That there are all kinds of predictions happening simultaneously in the frontal cortex, but we can only attend to one or a few of them, and that's what we become conscious about.
Yeah, I would say that there, Jan is identifying consciousness with attention. And I would say that
Yes.
everything that he said, you just said, seems right when it comes to attention. Attention is precisely a way of like selecting some object to devote our limited cognitive resources to. When we attend to something, then we process that. We don't process other things. If we didn't have severe cognitive limitations, maybe we wouldn't need to attend nearly as much. You could have, at the very least, you could have a very wide parallel field of attention. I'd just be careful. I would just distinguish attention from consciousness, because I think it may well be that there are beings who have much more distributed attention than we do, or maybe attend to everything. I wouldn't say that would thereby render them non-conscious. I would just say they have it in the sense of subjective experience.
Mm-hmm.
I would say they have subjective experience that's very different from ours because it wouldn't have this attention structure. But the attention structure is just one aspect of consciousness. It's not the
Right,
be
right.
all and end all of subjective experience. Yosh Rabengio, speaking of people in deep learning, Yosh Rabengio has been writing articles again on consciousness as a key to developing good machine learning systems. But I think he also, by consciousness, means roughly something like attention rather than subjective experience per se.
So that's a great segue to something I've been wanting to ask you, which is, can machines have consciousness? And the addendum to that is, are we approaching consciousness? Can one claim that systems like GPT-3, which you referred to in your book, which pretended to act like you, and most people couldn't tell whether it was you or not, are we sort of beginning to see some sort of glimmers of consciousness, or is that like a far-fetched idea at the moment?
Yeah, one of the creators of GPT-3, I guess, at OpenAI recently caused a minor kerfuffle on Twitter by saying maybe some of these large language models are a little bit conscious or slightly conscious. I think that was Ilya Slutskever. But I don't rule out that existing AI systems could have some element of consciousness. I'm open to the idea that consciousness is actually quite ubiquitous, and that even in very simple systems, there's some element of consciousness. If that's right, then maybe even in a multi-layer neural network, a simple one, there's some element of consciousness. Now, most people would probably reject that and say consciousness requires some significant degree of complexity. But then, a lot is going on inside those large language models, and who's to say they haven't hit, in some respects, the levels of complexity that's required. I mean, I take seriously the idea that like a worm with 300 neurons might have some simple element of subjective experience. And look at these large language models with their hundreds of billions of parameters and all their complex structure. Who's to say there's not some element of consciousness? I think we really need a theory of consciousness to know. I mean, no one, I think, would say confidently that current machine learning systems are conscious. And I think probably the consensus would be against it. But as they develop, as they get more and more complex, eventually approximating the complexity of the human brain, I think, I would certainly be on the side that says at least eventually there's going to be consciousness in these systems, and maybe even initially not human-like consciousness, maybe more like insect level consciousness or dog level consciousness, or maybe something different entirely, but maybe eventually human level consciousness. Once we get to human level AI, it wouldn't at all surprise me to find that they have human level consciousness.
Yeah, I was thinking it would be great to have a checklist. In theory, it'd be great, but even a checklist, that says, does the system get puzzled?
Mm.
Does it get confused? The kinds of things that we associate, at least with human kind of consciousness, sort of some kind of cognition. It'd be nice to have a simple checklist like that, where you could say, well, okay, it's level 0 or it's level 1 or something like that.
The one everyone knows is the Turing test. Does it behave indistinguishably from a human being? But why should we require that for consciousness? It's like maybe
Yep.
these systems will be conscious, and why should they be? Maybe they're going to be better than us in all kinds of ways. Why should they be forced to imitate us and our idiosyncrasies and limitations? It'd be nice to have a more general test than the Turing test. The philosopher Susan Schneider has proposed a artificial consciousness test, but basically involves asking the system questions about its consciousness. Are you having subjective experience right now? How does it feel for you? Can you understand that? Could you imagine other beings that have this or that don't have this, and see if they think about consciousness in ways analogous to the ways that we do? But I mean, again, maybe they have better ideas about consciousness than we do, so we don't want to limit them to just reproducing human reactions to consciousness.
So, Dave, I want to come back and try and wrap up with, revisiting reality and the fact that, with technology progressing, at the rate that it is, it's becoming difficult to tell real from virtual or real from fake, right? There's all of this sort of deep fake stuff out there. There's fake news, and so we're sort of confronting a situation where it's just becoming harder and harder, I think, to tell fact from fiction, to tell truth from, something that's been completely made up. Where does this leave us with respect to, being able to know what is truthful in the future?
Yeah, so this is where philosophy gets practical. We're actually dealing with not just these way off scenarios, but the systems we're actually going to be dealing with in the future. And yeah, we've mostly talked about the somewhat speculative stuff, but yeah, half of this book is about dealing with the artificial and virtual and augmented realities that we're going to be building in the decades to come. The so-called metaverse of immersive alternative reality, virtual reality environments. And yeah, one core part of that is the question of deep fakes. Right now, deep fakes are we've got images, photos, which are impressive, and we've got manipulated videos, which are getting better and better, especially with AI technology. We're getting now deep fakes at the level of language. You mentioned somebody gave GPT-3 a bunch of data from things I'd written and interviews with me, and it produced a rather halfway plausible seeming interview with me on that basis. I mean, I didn't think it was that great, but
Well, it
I thought
slipped up just one
I
time,
thought that
though.
that's not the real me. That was
Yeah.
definitely a level or two below. But other people said, "Oh, closer than you thought." But so yeah, I think especially though with AI technology developing, probably before too long, we'll be able to produce rather convincing virtual versions of people that speak in ways rather reminiscent of them. And the question will then arise if we run into a person, say in a virtual reality, or is this actually the original that I'm talking to? And likewise, I mean, this question already arises for fake news. How do I know that this news story is tracking reality and isn't just something that somebody made up? The best solution to this, as far as I can tell, is relying on some kind of authentication, and authentication by a reliable source. I mean, what do we do in the case of fake news? How do we, determine whether something is real? I guess, we tend to, use the reliability of certain sources. I think if it's printed in the New York Times, that's a pretty good sign, maybe not a perfect sign, but a pretty good sign that it really happened, or if I go check on a reliable fact-checking site like Snopes or whatever, and that's also a pretty good sign that it really happened. So maybe likewise the videos and the virtual realities of the future will have to come marked with some sign of authenticity by a uh, by a reliable source, where presumably the signs of authenticity can't themselves be easily faked. Maybe you have to go through some protocol to log in to make sure you're actually in a world where the signs of authenticity are genuine, and then that will be our marker of of what's guaranteed to be real. Without that, it may be that almost anything could eventually be simulated. I mean, I don't know. You're having a conversation with your mother, and then it's like, "Oh, is this really my mother?" Maybe then you can ask her a question like, "Hey, what about that thing when I was 8 years old? Where did we go?" And your mother will know, and the deepfakes won't know, and so on. But that's not always going to work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was thinking, maybe digital signatures will work for some things, but again, not all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what the answer to this is, but this seems to be a problem that's serious, sort of front and center these days, with Musk
Mm-hmm.
and Twitter and, what this new digital public square is going to look like. So exciting times, but also some really difficult problems to deal with because the technology's gotten so good.
Yeah, and it's very easily, even if it's possible to avoid being fooled, say by fake news and deep fakes, if you're critical enough. Of course, not everyone is going to be so critical, and if you're part of a community that takes all these things very seriously, then it'll be very easy to be taken in by fake news, by deep fakes, and no one has a perfect solution to avoiding this kind of misinformation completely.
Indeed. So, Dave, before we wrap up, I really enjoyed reading your book. Like I said, I thought it was like nothing I've read in computing or philosophy. So it's very different and sort of, occupies a pretty unique space. How would you characterize as sort of the key takeaways? Because I just had too many of them. I just sort of got
Mm.
immersed in it and I got into the philosophy and I just got into the whole thing, quite deeply and thoroughly enjoyed it. But, for people sort of, who are sort of getting into this area, curious about techno-philosophy, what do you think? How would you characterize the main takeaways from the book?
Yeah, that's interesting. You're probably right. There are a lot of different takeaways here. I wrote this book partly to introduce a whole lot of philosophical problems and to address many different philosophical problems. And there are some main theses, but many sub theses. And, in some ways, the book is a meditation on technology, but in other ways, it's a way of thinking about philosophy. Yes, well, there is that central slogan, which I think of as a takeaway: virtual reality is genuine reality, which is roughly don't underestimate virtual reality or digital reality in general. It's as real as any physical reality. And also, this kind of connects to issues about meaning and value in our lives. Some people would think that life in VR would have to be somehow meaningless. I think in principle it can be as meaningful as life in physical reality. So maybe that's like an optimistic um, takeaway here. Of course, there's also the many dystopian possibilities with VR that we haven't really talked about. The one also has to pay very careful attention to. Deepfakes just being just one of those. But maybe also thinking about there's a broader takeaway. I mean, there's the specific slogans of the book, but maybe there's also broader takeaways, which is, it's possible to think rigorously about technology and about the future and about the philosophical issues that arise. We might think of philosophy as this very abstract, speculative subject devoted to figuring out the fundamental nature of reality, and we can think about that rigorously. But also, at certain points, philosophy becomes very practical. We're actually going to be building these virtual realities and trying to live meaningful lives in them. We'll be building AI and having to figure out what kind of rights to give them. We're going to have to be dealing with deep fakes and virtual worlds and so on. At some point along the way, I think thinking about philosophical questions has a real role to play in dealing practically with this technology and figuring out where we want it to go.
Well put, Dave. And I do have one more question that sort of popped into my mind, which is, do we need new kinds of laws to deal with the sort of virtual reality that's emerging? Because, this stuff, as you point out, virtual reality is real. The stuff that can happen there that can influence you, that can actually influence your real life. So do you think we're going to need new kinds of laws to deal with the sort of new world of virtual reality?
I think so. And I think at the very least, we're going to have to extend our existing laws to enable them to better deal with what goes on in virtual worlds. Because right now, our legal system often treats what goes on inside a virtual world as kind of like what goes on in a game or a theme park or something. It's not fully real. But now, people have situations like there are virtual sexual assaults in VR where people molest other people's avatars, and this is quite traumatic for people who go through this. There's also virtual theft where virtual property is stolen, and the question is that just okay? It wasn't great, but is it just a little thing? My view is, in principle, these things can be just as serious as physical world theft, physical world assault, and so on. But for the most part, our legal system and our moral system is still catching up with that. But the more you take on board this idea that virtual reality is genuine reality, and the more people start spending time, in the metaverse of the future, which won't just be video games, but will be carrying out the kinds of activities that we associate with the physical world. I think our legal system is going to have to, at the very least, elevate what goes on inside VR to a level of legal seriousness that's analogous to that in the physical world. And furthermore, there's going to be many new forms of life in virtual worlds which don't have direct counterparts in physical reality, and presumably we're going to need new laws and new moral norms and so on to deal with that. So I think it's going to be a very rich and complex area for ethicists, for political theorists, for legal theorists, for social theorists to think about in the decades to come.
Indeed, interesting times ahead. So, any advice for young people, Dave, as a professor?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Young people in general, it depends so much on what they want to do and what their goals are. But if they're interested in philosophy, which maybe they are, if they're still here more than an hour into this this podcast, I would say, think of philosophy as something that's. Some people think of philosophy as just something you make up, and you can speculate on the nature of the universe. And that's a whole lot of fun. But philosophy is something you can do rigorously, I think, by methodical arguments that make a case for your conclusion. And it's also something which can be very practical when you combine it with technology and so on. So I think we want in the future. I think we're going to want to have philosophers who have a very strong background in technology to think about philosophical issues. But it's also going to be important to have the people who are building the technology to actually have a background in philosophical issues. I mean, some of the leading people building the technology right now. Yeah, you mentioned Jan LeCun. He was an undergraduate in philosophy and credits that for a lot of his for the building of a lot of his central ideas. So I would say, even if you're planning to go into a career in technology and AI, say, or in building virtual worlds, and I think a background in philosophy can be extremely helpful in that project. So I'd like to see more and more people integrating philosophy and technology in the years to come.
Dave, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for being on the pod and sharing your time and expertise with the rest of the world.
Oh, thanks so much, Prasad, for the great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I did too. It was fun. Thanks, Dave.